All right, when you think about America's origin story, what comes to mind? Probably pilgrims, right? Thanksgiving dinner? Well, the real story, the gritty beginning, actually happened more than a decade before that. And it's a story of horror, survival, and revolution that honestly most of us have completely forgotten.
Just listen to this. This comes from George Percy, who is actually the president of Jamestown. He's describing a winter so awful they called it the starving time. And when he says they were digging up corpses to eat, yeah, he's not talking about animals. He's talking about people, his own fellow colonists.
And the scale of this disaster is just staggering. That number you see, 60, that's how many people survived. Out of 500 colonists who started that winter, only 60 were left standing. Think about that. Nearly 90% of the population just gone.
For centuries, historians kind of wondered if these stories were, maybe a bit exaggerated. But then archaeologists found Jane. And Jane is the name they gave to the remains of a 14-year-old girl. Her bones had clear, unmistakable butcher marks. This was it, the first hard forensic proof that those horrifying stories of cannibalism, they were absolutely real.
So, with stories like that, is it any wonder Jamestown has had a serious image problem for like 400 years? I mean, when we remember it at all, we remember it as a total catastrophe, right? A complete and utter failure.
And the case against Jamestown, the official story, has always boiled down to these four main charges. 1, they picked a disastrous, swampy location. 2, they were constantly at war with the local Native American tribes. 3, the colonists themselves were supposedly these lazy, inept gentlemen who wouldn't get their hands dirty. And 4, because of all that, the death toll was just appalling.
But what if that's not the whole story? What if we've been looking at this like it's a crime scene, and for 400 years, we've been blaming the victim instead of figuring out who the real culprit was? Because that's exactly what new evidence is starting to suggest.
Okay, so let's dig into the evidence, because new findings from both archaeology and science are totally flipping the script on Jamestown.
All right, let's tackle that first myth, the lazy colonist. The story that they were all these useless gentlemen who couldn't handle real work. Well, archaeology tells a very different story. Recent digs have uncovered all sorts of artifacts from a whole range of industries. We're talking goldsmiths, jewelers, blacksmiths. They even found the remains of the first glass factory in America. These people were absolutely working, and they were working hard. But that leads to a really obvious question, doesn't it? If they were all working so hard, why on earth did they starve to death? Well, it turns out the answer wasn't some flaw in the colonists themselves. It was in the world around them. Scientists studied the tree ring data from these ancient 800-year-old cypress trees in the area, and what they found is just incredible. The colonists landed smack in the middle of the worst drought that region had seen in 770 years. This wasn't just a bit of bad luck, it was a legitimate, record-breaking, natural disaster.
So the old myth says they were just too incompetent to feed themselves. But the reality? That mega drought crippled agriculture for everybody, including the local Powhatan tribes. That made trading for food almost impossible. And yeah, the rivers were full of fish, but the colonists were missing one crucial ingredient to preserve all that fish for the long winter: salt. They just didn't have a way to produce enough of it.
But look, this story isn't just about tearing down old myths about failure. It's also about uncovering some incredible and, frankly, forgotten successes. Because these people weren't just survivors, they were pioneers.
And this is maybe the most important takeaway of all. Jamestown wasn't a failure, it was the prototype. A messy, absolutely brutal, but ultimately successful experiment that literally laid the groundwork for what would become America.
And they figured things out incredibly fast. I mean, within just 1 decade, they figured out that tobacco was a viable cash crop, and that created a booming market economy. Then, in 1617, they came up with the headright system, which established the whole basis for private property ownership. A pretty core American idea, right? And get this, by 1619, the very first representative government in North America, the General Assembly, was meeting right there in the Jamestown Church. So you've got private property, free enterprise, self-government. All of these ideas were born in this place we've been calling a failure.
Okay, so that brings us to the final mystery. If Jamestown was so foundational to America, why do we all remember the Pilgrims at Plymouth instead? Why has this incredible story been buried for so long?
Well, the answer, weirdly enough, has way more to do with 19th century politics than 17th century reality. See, as the country was heading toward the Civil War, the tensions between the North and South were just boiling over. And after the war was done, historians in the victorious North basically elevated their own origin story, the New England Pilgrims, and framed it as the nation's true moral and democratic beginning. And Jamestown? It was a Southern story, so it got recast as a tale of lazy aristocratic failure, and pretty soon it was just a footnote in the history book.
So that leaves us with one final big question. As we unearth this truer story of Jamestown, which version of America's origins do we choose to remember? The sanitized, clean myth of a peaceful beginning, or the gritty, complicated, and maybe much more human reality?